Okay, we start. A very warm welcome to yet another online debate organized by the Florence School of Regulation. This week, you're tuning into the FSR Talks, which is a format where we interact with leading experts from the network and where they're presenting interesting work undertaken by them on leading topics that would be of interest to all of us. So this week, the focus is on just energy transition. And we have joining us for this debate, three key experts from outside the Florence School. We have Rohit Chandra from IIT Delhi, and who's also a visiting fellow at CPRI in India. Then we have Johan van den Berg, who is the head of the Secretariat of the African-Europe Energy Partnership. And we have Jesse Burton, who is a senior researcher at the University of Cape Town. And we have our director, Jean-Michel Glechon, who will be who's the co-host and also contributing from the EU perspective. So we have our panelists who will talk on the topic of just energy transition. I think this is the new buzzword of the year. And I think it's a very interesting topic for us to discover together, because while we know we all have to transition into a sustainable energy future, the question is to discover how we go about that while balancing the needs of the environment and of the people that are going through this transition. So while the switch and the modeling scenarios are easier to model, we have to really see how to implement it on the ground. So here we will have panelists talking about bottom-up approaches that need to go hand in hand with top-down analysis and implementation policies that are presented in the world today. So with that, I would like to hand the floor to Rohit Chandra, who will present to us, followed by interventions from Johan, Jesse, and Professor. Rohit, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Shweta. It's a real pleasure to be involved with anything that the Florence School of Regulation is doing. Obviously their reputation precedes them. And this is obviously a topic very close to my heart. So I'm delighted that you are doing programming on this issue. So just a bit of background, I'm a political scientist and economic historian who's based out of IIT Delhi School of Public Policy in the Center for Policy Research. And I've studied the Indian coal industry for the last decade. And I'm currently working on a book on the political and economic history of the industry over the last 50 years. And so when Shweta approached me to kind of work on something like this, I thought it would be useful to contrast kind of some of the differences that are emerging between kind of the just transition conversations that we see in places like Germany, Europe, kind of the developed world, and what we see in China and India and some other places. And so I'm going to present a little bit about the Indian experience and also some stylized contrast between developed and developing world just transition conversations, which I hope that I can get engagement from all of our esteemed panelists. So I guess the first question is, what is a just transition, right? There's lots of definitions of this, but it actually originates from the 1970s kind of American politics when the Environmental Protection Act was being passed. And it's attributed to Tony Mazzocchi, who was kind of a big union leader in the US at the time, who was basically asking for various things, including some kind of worker super fund to be created, as the implementation of the Environmental Protection Act led to job losses in oil, chemical, and atomic energy. Since then, over the last 50 years, this has been appropriated by various labor organizations and various multinational organizations and kind of evolved. And I think the ITUC formulation is perhaps kind of the ideal, which summarizes a lot of what we've been thinking about, right? An economy-wide process that produces the plans, policies, and investments that will lead to a future where all jobs are green and decent, emissions are at net zero, poverty is eradicated, and communities are thriving and resilient. So this is a fantastic vision for the future. Doing this is very difficult. And so I'm going to think through some of these processes and especially what it might look like in the Indian context and what we are seeing today. I think one of the things is that just transitions are not just about some techno-economic vision of the future, right? It's also about loss aversion. Large parts of the economy have been invested in carbon and carbon-related kind of industries. And there are going to be massive job losses. We've already seen them in the developed world. We might see them over the next few decades in the developing world. And so it's about understanding the radiative effects of shutting down fossil fuel industries, right? And I think the unfortunate simplicity that comes with a lot of this is just to think about direct employment, just to think about unionized employees and say, this is it. Now, that might work in Europe and the US, but that does not work in the developing world, right? And so, I mean, obviously there's kind of upstream and downstream induced employment. But there's also a lot of informal employment. And informality is something which I think economists and quantitative social scientists hate to think about, but I think this is something which is essential if you want to think about how this will play out in the developing world. And I'm sure I have stories on this, and I think Jesse and Johan can talk in this direction as well. And then you also have to think about the broader welfare effects. So especially in India, but I think in China, in the US, and parts of Europe as well, coal isn't just an industry, right? It's a way of life. Entire infrastructures, cities, towns have been created. In India, I can point to at least 5 to 10 different cities which have their schools, their roads, their hospitals, their water supply, their power coming from the radiative effects of this industry, right? Their employees spending money, the companies spending money, all of the other small industries and markets that come up around it. And so I'm quite frustrated with people like Antonio Gutierrez who come to India, taught at a think tank and say, we should stop investing in coal right now. It's more complicated than that. This is a difficult conversation and it deserves nuance. And so I think these kind of unilateral statements are not particularly useful. Communities were built around coal and communities will be destroyed. And we need to understand how these communities work. So I'm going to set up some stylized differences between what I think some of the differences between developed world just transition conversations are like and what developing world just transitions are. I think the first thing, and this might, I'm coming primarily from the Indian context, so I'm happy for pushback on these ideas, is that labor is not a unified class in India, right? Even from kind of independence onwards, labor unions had some strength, but did not have the same kind of political mobilization that we saw in the UK, in France, and a bunch of other countries where industrial labor forces basically defined an entire generation of politics. That just didn't happen in India. And every political party has its own coal union, right? So, I mean, in some senses, that is one big difference which exists. The second thing, and I think this is by far the most important, is that formal job losses are just the tip of the iceberg, right? My guess is that over 90% of job losses in India because of coal are not because of Coal India or formal laborers. India has maybe about 500,000 formal coal laborers, and I'll show you some estimates, probably 10 million people who are dependent on the coal industry. Unless you think about those people, you are doing this exercise wrong. And I think this is something worth thinking about a little more. Also, I think it's just developing countries have much less fiscal space. You don't have welfare super funds. You don't have kind of the German coal commission kind of generosity coming around most of the time. And so, at one level, you're not going to have the welfare super funds, but also your consumers are not going to finance it, right? So the energy vendor kind of community solar, community wind model is not transplantable to other developing countries. That's a problem. That's something we need to think about, right? At least in the Indian case, so far, the solar story and most of the renewable story has been grid connected. I know Africa may be a little different depending on where you're considering it, but at least in the grid connected renewable energy just does not have the same employment multipliers. You don't have cities and towns and entire infrastructures coming around grid connected RE. These are kind of isolated infrastructures which may create construction jobs temporarily, but are mainly capital intensive, low labor assets, right? So this RE is going to replace coal conversation, I don't think is particularly productive. And then finally, I think, the definition of a developing country is low state capacity, right? Your state can only do so much. And so can you really expect all of these transformative gains to come from the government, or do you really need the private sector involved in a big way, right? Economic development is a huge problem in the developing world. And when you're going to hit people who are already very close to precarity and poverty and say, we are going to take away these jobs, that means more in the developing world than it does in the developed world, where worker transitions are more feasible. I'm not saying they're not politically difficult, but at least there's kind of a movement to opportunity mentality which exists. So just to give you some rough estimates of India, right? And so basically I took shaped files of India's coal belt, put buffers around them, estimated how many people live within 25, 50, 100, 200 kilometers of the coal belt. You have roughly 50 million people who live within 50 kilometers of mines in India. And my guess would be at least 1/3 of these people are directly dependent on coal in one way or the other for their family and daily livelihood, right? So the economic multipliers of coal are massive. The 500,000 formal workforce is a floor, not a ceiling. The ceiling is much, much higher. And I mean, for various reasons, I am not optimistic about a renewable energy transition in India's coal belt in the short to medium term, let's say in the next 5-7 years. So what's being created in these areas is entire markets, right? The vegetable sellers, the people who are kind of selling various kinds of small goods. And so so I'll get to that in a little bit. There's also a big spatial mismatch in India, right? So this is the vision of what coal employment looks like to people ideally, right? This kind of mechanized, unionized, high-tech work in the coal industry. The reality of India is that the median coal-related employment in India looks more like this. These people do not have formal contracts. They do not have pensions. They're picking at the small things left over in mines and selling it in small markets. And you are going to disempower an entire group of people who have been doing this for, honestly, almost a century in India. Now, I mean, there's one line of argument which says it's a small group of people, overcome the politics, move on. This is hurting the rest of the country. That's not how the politics of these states work, right? There's going to be major opposition to this. And so I think that's something worth thinking about. The good part is that these people don't earn that much money. So the cost of replacing their livelihoods is actually much lower than a formal, large pensioned kind of, high-tech employee base. And so, those are some of the good and bad things. Just to give you a sense of the spatial spread of coal in India, this big kind of eastern bloc contains 95% of India's coal. So most of India's coal is in this kind of central eastern region. There is coal in some other places, but it's not as significant. But what we can see is that India's prime wind and solar resources are on the other side of the country, in the west and the south. And these also happen to be the most industrialized and highest per capita income states in India. So in some senses, you are taking the lowest per capita, lowest socio-economic development part of the country, and you are taking away a lifeblood industry from them. What does that mean? I mean, that means economic disaster. Some of these people are going back to settled agriculture. Some of these people are going back to even worse lives. And so the question is that, I mean, it's not clear that renewable energy is going to be replacing coal in the short to medium term in Eastern India, given the political economy of financing new capital assets and renewable energy and all of these kinds of things. All of India's solar industry is concentrated in 4 or 5 states in the south or in the west. So that's kind of a geographic issue which we will have to deal with. Now, I think there's a larger conversation to be had about why just transitions make international institutions uncomfortable. And specifically, I'm thinking about the UNFCCC, the World Bank, some of these organizations, right? The entire purpose of the UNFCCC was to deal with national governments, have them make commitments, INDCs, whatever it is, and then they'll figure out their domestic politics, right? Just transitions are forcing international organizations to think about subnational politics. And this is not something they are good at. The World Bank has never been good about understanding state politics in India, right? The UNFCCC certainly doesn't. The ILO is not particularly good at it either, right? And so because you abstract away from it, then, in some senses, I think some of these organizations lose the authority to talk about these things in a concrete way, because it's always abstract modeling, quant economist driven conversations, right? And so at least what I see playing out in India is that bilateral conversations with GIZ, USAID, AFDs, these kinds of organizations, which actually take domestic politics more seriously, are much more productive than multilateral conversations on just transitions, which I think are stuck in a very unproductive place right now. The other thing is that just transitions are necessarily polycentric, right? And what that means is that you can't just go to one organization, plug in and say, how do I do a just transition, right? You have to understand politics. You have to understand labor. You have to understand what district level business looks like. You have to interact with many actors. This requires building communities, consensus, and compromise. And all of this is messy, and it does not fit into the 1.5 degrees C, net zero alarmism that we see in global conversations today, right? So anyone who's running a model saying that coal needs to be phased out in the next 15 years, otherwise we'll never hit 1.5 degrees C, I mean, they're so far away from the reality of what's happening in India, I can't talk to them sometimes. It's not useful after a point. The problem is that you cannot just land up in New Delhi, Beijing, Pretoria, wherever it is, and have these conversations. Even the NGOs and the government don't always know the ground realities particularly well. And so you actually have to go on ground. You have to go to these districts. You have to talk to the civil society organizations and the district administrations. And the best organizations are doing that. Some organization like iForest in India has started doing this kind of work, or Energy Foundation in China, but there's not much work in that direction yet. And then finally, because labor is fragmented, something like tripartite consultation doesn't work nearly as well in most developing countries. So there's no one labor organization you can bring to the table and say, what are the terms of a just transition, right? There's 5 different ones. They all have different demands. They can barely agree. And so, I think sometimes we need to rethink this kind of tripartite consultation thing because it isn't very productive sometimes. So then finally, this is kind of a somewhat critical conversation. What do we do about it, right? As kind of researchers, as policy practitioners. I think one of the things is having decentralized economic transition and planning scenarios, right? District and province level economic profile work in India and other countries is very useful, right? And unfortunately, in India, I don't see much inclination towards that direction as well. But you have a very vibrant kind of civil society which is starting to work in this direction. And so maybe they will have to take the lead and the government will follow, right? But this requires social scientists and researchers on the ground, not economists and modelers in offices. Even within kind of the Delhi techno-economic community, I'm quite frustrated with people who look at labor force surveys and suddenly understand what's happening in these districts when they've never visited them. If you haven't visited them, frankly, you don't have the authority to speak about what's happening there. And so I think we need a generation of anthropologists and political scientists and people other than economists working on this. Or you need economists of the old style, like Albert Hirschman, who actually went to the field and did things, right? Secondly, I think there is a lot of work to be done on understanding the public sector and state capitalism. Energy industries in a lot of developing countries are still state-run. And so just applying market fundamentalist principles just falls flat so spectacularly that it doesn't work, right? So how can you co-opt state-owned enterprises? How are they pivoting as organizations? I think this is very important. In India, we are already seeing that, for example, Coal India and NTPC's financial surpluses are being used for things like financing the International Solar Association, right? That's something I couldn't
We
have
have 1
imagined.
minute out.
Yeah, I'm almost done. I think cross-border communications of just transitions have just not taken off in a good way yet. There's some good books like Total Transition by Sandeep Pai. I think the Mercator Research Institute in Berlin is doing work in this direction. But I've never seen anyone who comes to me and says, look, this is what happened in Newcastle. This is what happened in West Virginia. What can India learn from this? I would like to have more of those conversations. And then finally, I think the financial conversation of how is the next generation of industry going to be financed, right? Everyone talks about ESG, but no one knows quite how it's going to play out. And especially when it's mediated by state-owned lending and banking, the name of the game changes a lot. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done in that direction. I think we can all contribute a lot more there. I'll stop there. Thank you, Shweta and Jean-Michel, for inviting me, and I look forward to a productive conversation. Yeah, any of you want to reach me, you can reach me here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rohit, for that excellent presentation. We already see some reactions from the audience. Just a quick reminder, those of you who have questions, you can drop your questions in the Q&A chat box or directly also drop it to the panelists, but the Q&A chat box is something that everyone can view. So I urge you to drop your questions there. Now we'll move on to the panelists. First off, Johan, maybe you can take the floor. I know Jessie was all smiles. She has a lot of counter remarks, but probably Johan, you can ease into the conversation.
Yeah, just a few opening remarks. Thank you very much for having me. It's a very interesting discussion point and very nice, very good panelists. Thank you very much. Maybe to start off with where I agree, this is a very complex topic, not at all simple, easy at a high level, very complex when you get down to ground level and to actual people in their lives. And maybe 2 short anecdotes on that. The one thing I've noticed is even when the promise of renewable energy is that similar numbers of jobs will be created, and that happens in some parts of the world, it's often very difficult to tell an individual why he or she who presently has a job will again be the person at the other end having a job, especially if there's entrenched unemployment in that specific economy. So while the numbers may stay the same, at an individual level, there's a fear and an anxiety that the individual will not have a job again. I've also been in a whole day discussion where I sat in on a trade union deliberating about climate change. And at the end, somebody got up and said, I don't care if just as many jobs get created again, because those people will not be belonging to this trade union. So that's the very focused, narrow perspective, and one that we ultimately have to respect, because it is ultimately a reality. So, I mean, this is in addition to the opening remarks by Rohit on the fact that most people are not even in the formal sector, and I think I agree with the fact that the knock-on effect and the ultimate number of people that are involved is much, much larger than the job numbers that we see. I mean, at a more fundamental level, I think what jumped out at me from Robert's perspective was, I think somewhere that he said it was impractical to aim for 1.5 degrees. And at one level, I agree, because the time frame within which we have to fundamentally change so many things in our world is extremely short. And on the other hand, I very strongly believe that the thresholds, the environmental thresholds that are represented by 1.5 degrees or by 2 degrees are real. They're not really negotiable, and therefore we have no option but to meet these thresholds and these timelines. So, I wanted maybe to frame the debate by saying we are faced with two opposing truths that exist at the same time. The one, this is very difficult to do in a very short time frame with people on the ground who don't always get consulted. On the other hand, this is something we absolutely have to achieve. So, I mean, to just wrap it all up in terms of an opening statement, that takes me then to saying, well, what, as the Africa-EU Energy Partnership, we're all about partnership between continents, in this case, Europe and Africa. I think what we need is to show, firstly, to cross-learn, the point that Rod made at the end, and then secondly, to create success examples, even if it's in islands in each country, to at least show people that this can be done and how it can be done, and that success is possible, to at least ease the human stress level. And then at the last stage, maybe to really get out to a very granular level and physically make lists of the people that are going to lose their jobs and engage them about each of them and how they're going to be okay, because to tell at a high level that this will be fine is just not good enough. That's all for now. Thanks, Sveta.
Thank you, Johan. Maybe you can formulate a question or two for Rohit while I give the floor to Jessie. Jessie, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Jessie Burton. I'm a researcher at the University of Cape Town and an associate at E3G. I was smiling because I sort of agree, but I also disagree. And I think it's kind of interesting to tease out the differences and in particular to look at developing countries, because one of the things that sort of really resonated with me in this talk is around loss aversion, and just how important every single job is in places with very high levels of structural unemployment and no alternative. There's no social welfare net for people who lose their livelihoods. But also, of course, that people who are living on the margins are the most vulnerable, and we know that they're most likely to be impacted by the impacts of climate change. So we're in this terrible bind. So to talk a little bit about South Africa and maybe tease some of these areas out a little bit more. So South Africa's got a very considerable challenge, not as considerable as India. The scale of everything is always dwarfed by India and China. And I also come from an interesting perspective. I think I studied history, but I work in an energy and economics modeling team. So I bridge these these two groups of these two worlds. But just sort of some of the basics on South Africa. We've got about 90,000 coal miners who work directly in the sector. They have something between 3 and 10 dependents per coal miner. Another 10 to 15,000 people working in our state-owned utility, Eskom, in power plants. And then we also convert coal into liquid fuels in Sasol's coal to liquids, which has got both a chemicals and a conversion plant and its associated mining. South Africa is the most coal-dependent energy system in the G20. We are actually much more coal-dependent than China and India. Coal is 70% of our emissions. So our challenge around transitioning to a low-carbon economy is really almost all about coal. There are interesting similarities, and I was actually in Dunbud in India once, and I took a lot of pictures of people on the bikes because it's this very similar in South Africa. A lot of informal use of coal, especially women and children who are picking for own use. So there's a whole energy poverty, kind of household energy fuel use problem, which is not really even thought about when people consider labor force impacts and coal mine closures and that sort of thing. And there are also men who are mining artisanally like that for sale. So that's going all the way to Joburg in some cases. And the problem with South Africa, or the challenge, I suppose, is that coal is no longer competitive. So we're facing a decline anyway. And our big risk, unlike India, is in fact that we're a large exporter. So half of the value of the sector comes from exports, which hinge primarily on the Indian power sector and the Indian sponge iron sector. So what happens in your energy policy actually impacts a lot here, and that's preparation that the state has to do for transition that is out of their control. And for me, the big fear that's not even about just transitions, it's just transitions, is that governments are not prepared for those kinds of risks yet. So where did your talk sort of resonate with me? Okay, South Africa has 42% unemployment. That's what we had, you know, before COVID. In Mpumalanga, our main coal region, it's 43%. We're kind of in an economic crisis now. So we cannot afford job losses. Going back to what Johan said, you know, really a just transition plan means making very sure that there is a plan for workers. They're going to retire, you have a pension fund, you have a redeployment plan for individuals or for their children. Maybe, you know, the other part of this just transition thinking is one that you're backward looking, you're thinking about each individual worker or, you know, community member who might be selling food informally around mines, for example, those sorts of things. But we're also thinking about structural change. So how do we create more jobs? How do we create dynamism in an economy where actually you have all these structural problems anyway? And that's really South Africa's challenge. The economy is not inclusive. It's not even stagnant. I mean, we've been in a recession for many years now, and so there's this double risk around transition and around a failure to really get an economy that works for people. So of course, loss aversion is huge where you don't have any of these social nets. The other thing that I think that was maybe absent from what you were saying is that coal is a great environmental justice paradox, right? It brings development into these regions. People sometimes have much higher earnings than the background wages. So, I mean, if you're a coal miner in South Africa, you're even an entry-level coal miner, your median wage is double that of someone working in the agricultural sector. So in that way, it's really great, but you also have high levels of poverty. You have very high levels of sickness. It's not uncommon for local communities to not be able to get jobs in coal mines because they're too sick to work. I think what's very, very important is this question around labor. So labor internationally, but also in South Africa, are like the progenitor of just transition. That's why it's in our climate policy, it's in our NDC. And they're really progressive on climate in many ways, but it's also an existential threat. Union people will say to you things like very poignantly, you know, I can't feed my kids with a job in a model. So even if there are more jobs in renewables and having well-priced electricity might have outcomes for the whole economy, that doesn't help people with their transition, right? And I think we're focused very much on coal, but this is also much bigger than that. A low carbon economy, as decarbonized economies, are going to mean changes in steel. It's going to mean changes in the way cities are designed, in cars, in all sorts of manufacturing sectors, all of which are going to have to need a transition. And my fear is that while all these fears and concerns that we're raising are very important, if you're too backward looking, you kind of leave an economy to stagnate. To not be prepared for the 21st century, to not be prepared to be competitive in terms of exports or these kind of bigger national questions around economic development and growth. And of course, that must also be inclusive growth. So protecting those old sectors doesn't deliver necessarily a good developmental outcome in the long term anyway. But we're in this awkward and difficult position of having to protect workers and communities while also trying to work out how to subsidize or grow or develop new sectors. Thank you. And so, my main question maybe is that, can case studies from developed countries even help us in the developing world? We did a world-class just transition process in South Africa, and every now and again, very well-meaning, mostly Europeans, apologies to the European listeners, will say, you know, have you looked at this example or this example? They did a lot of public participation. And I'll say, well, we did more than that in South Africa. You know, we've had a really inclusive process, but we don't have any money. So again, what's the role of, you know, is there a global equity element here around partnerships, around climate reparations, which says if we're going to move faster, I mean, these changes are coming anyway, but we need to go faster in terms of climate constraint. What's the role of the developed world in supporting that transition to make it just? Thank you.
Thank you, Jessie. Professor, the floor is all yours for your intervention.
Thank you, Shweta. I would like to congratulate Rohit and the two following speakers, Johan and Jess, because I'm not familiar with the topic at all for two reasons. I do not know anything about coal. We stopped using it since so many years or decades. The last thing I saw something serious about coal in France, I was 16 years old, and I am 70 today, so you can see where we are. And second, because I do not know developing countries. I know India because we have a unit in India, and I know India because I'm extremely interested by what India is reinventing, which is to have very developed advanced industry and simultaneously having people looking for their survival or for elementary justice, but I'm not familiar of this. And I noticed that Rohit is back to the economics I was doing 30 years ago. I thought it had disappeared, but I'm understanding that absolutely not. It has to be multidisciplinary, which is we are dealing with human situations, human realities, having not a single dimension, having multiple dimensions, and being islands. We think India is a country, but you are telling us, okay, but even the state is not necessarily the relevant level, the state in the Indian sense, the 25 or 30 states you have, and the relevant level is the community, which is a district. What I immediately translate to an island to make it very clear for everybody. So it's island cases. We need case study. We need multidisciplinary studies because we have to understand how changes are possible. And the changes underlined by Jess, which is, who is very pushy, what I like also. But we are confronted to the fact that being pushy is possible if we understand how these communities are living, how they consider themselves, how they move, how they change. And I understand that Western Europe, typically Italy, France, and other countries, Belgium, etc., we are not living in the same world. It is true that we have nations, we have national markets, we have these wonderful Western schools where not all the working class, but unfortunately, I will say, the best of the working class can go up, even immigrants. The number of excellent students I had, and I still have, even at PhD level, coming from the migrant working class is an absolute fact. And I understand that this does not necessarily work. However, there is two things I would like to add. The fact that in the Western EU, well, coal is not a big issue or not an issue at all, but car automotive will be an issue. We do not need so many workers to produce electric cars, and they will be less qualified. We have a big question mark with aerospace. Do we need planes in the future? I mean, even the far future. Will we need planes? What kind of plane? And as said recently, steel, cement. My small country, France, did see 15,000 jobs disappearing in aerospace and car automotive since March. Well, 15,000, you will say in India, okay, but it's a joke. But you have to multiply by 20 to see the size in India. Huh? It's 300,000 jobs disappearing in only a few months. How will we deal with this? However, we have fantastic political tools in the EU. One, I just said, is the fact that we still have a good school system. It's not perfect, which means many working class people or migrants are dissatisfied with the way they are treated as a bloc, but many of their kids are well treated. But the second part of it is that we did understand in the pandemic crisis that the pandemic crisis is only a very fast explosion of what could happen in the future, and the way we will go out of the pandemic with classical tools to rebuild economy has to be directly linked with the Green Deal, linked with energy transition, and linked with just energy transition. How will we do? We still do not know. But Rohit is helping us to understand why we do not know. Because we have several hundreds of billions in the European Green Deal. But it's not at the European stage that the good way of using it can be elaborated and made. It's not even at the national stage, it's sometimes at the under-national stage. So what is critical in the EU is countries doing well their job, governments of the countries, doing well their job in negotiating with the regions where are the steel industry, cement industry, aerospace, car automotive, and finding with them how to open doors to the future. If EU can do this, I suppose we will learn something, and I will tell you why, and I will stop there. Joe Stiglitz and Nick Stern did a paper 4 months ago, a paper looking at how to transform pandemic recovery into a good transition to the sustainable future. And they were saying, one of the fundamental policy we need is to invest into human capital, because we already know that the jobs of the future are not the jobs of today. So it's very well known, and it's known at IMF, it's known at World Bank. They know that they have to address human capital. They have to understand how it works. I can give you an example. Even in Latin America, they know that human capital is made of male and female. If we do not consider genders in this transition, in this just transition, we will just not make it fair. If it is not fair, it won't be supported. If it is not supported, it won't succeed. That's the only thing I can tell. But to conclude, I did learn much more from you that I have to tell you today.
Thank you, Professor. Johan, maybe a quick 30 seconds to you before we hand the floor to Rohit to respond to all of you.
Yeah, so Rohit, the question from my side, you said, that just transition forces international organizations to get involved in subnational politics. I don't quite follow that. Is it not possible that national governments can mediate the challenges that arise in the east of India with coal, with the benefits that arise in the west and in the north with renewable energy? And why do you say that it's necessary for international organizations to do this mediation?
Shall I respond?
Yes, Rohit, the floor is all yours.
Yeah, so I'll start with Johan's questions. I don't think they need to get involved in subnational politics, but I think it has to be a consideration when they formulate policies, right? So I think one of the things was that when INDCs and all of these things were formed, it was kind of a black box, right? You say you will do so much in 20 years, we hope you will do so much, right? It turns out that a lot of those countries may not be able to even meet those targets, right? And so what I'm seeing, at least sitting in Delhi a little bit, is that the people who are taking just transition seriously, after a point you say, okay, I'm going to find certain states and try to create case studies, right? If a certain bilateral development agency comes to me and says, I want to work on this, what do I tell them? I say, go to Dhanbad, go to one of these districts, find the politicians there, find the union leaders there, find the civil society organizations there, and try to create an example which can lead to some kind of bootstrapping, right? The problem is that, you have to work on coal, which no multilateral organization under the sun ever wants to fund anything on. But that honestly binds them, right? They become irrelevant if they will not engage with the issue. I remember talking to a lead energy specialist at the World Bank who said, look, we're not going to finance hydro, we're not going to finance coal, we're not going to finance gas, we're not going to finance nuclear. If RE and distribution are the only things you're financing, you make yourselves irrelevant in places which have alternatives. And we're already seeing with the World Bank in a big way, right? So all I want them to do is at least engage with this more seriously if they care about the issue, right? Because they have allocative mechanisms, they have access to money, all of these kinds of things. I just think they're putting it in bad places right now. So that's I don't think they should get involved in the politics. I don't think that's the job of international multilateral institutions. But if they're engaging with it seriously, then they need to talk to different people, right? They can't just go to the diplomats and say, oh, you promised this, okay, we trust you, we'll do it, right? The two-level game is more complicated than that. I agree with most of what Jesse said. I think the climate equity question is an interesting one. Climate reparations is I mean, it's a wish list. I don't know if it will ever happen, right? But I mean, everyone's fiscally constrained right now. No one wants to give money for anything. COVID makes everything worse. I just have no hope that that would ever happen. I mean, it's you know, it's one of those things where like you hope in some different world it would realize itself. But if it happens, I mean, I think what we need is like 10 different mechanisms like the CDM, right? Instead, what we have is the CDM disappearing and very little replacing it. So, I mean, in some senses, I would like to see some of those conversations. And I think some of those are developing in different ways, but I see them more developing bilaterally than multilaterally. And maybe that's a conversation worth having of which way is actually better or more optimal, right? I think the difference is small countries which don't have any bargaining power may actually transition more quickly because they have no choice and they only get lending for certain things. Larger countries which can say, we have access to different kinds of money. We're growing relatively quickly. We can go to international financial markets. You'll give us cheap money. Everyone has money and no one knows where to invest it right now. We'll find cheap money. We don't need your money if you're going to come with conditions, right? And so I think those are things which are happening, which separate, let's say, the G20 or kind of the 30 largest economies from the rest of the world. And so, I mean, Johan, I'd be interested in hearing what kind of smaller African versus larger African countries have done in this process. And I mean, I come across as somewhat kind of aggressive on this position because everyone is talking anti-coal, right? I mean, I do completely concede that this is an environmental paradox that in 30 years, if we're not using coal, that would be a fantastic thing. I just don't see the movement quickly enough to give me any hope that that will happen yet. And so I guess I want to see more of these political conversations happening rather than the techno-economic conversations. And I'm trying to move kind of the compass a little bit in that direction. And in terms of transferability of learning, I totally agree with you. I mean, what happens in Newcastle and West Virginia isn't strictly applicable. What I think is really useful is the forms of dispute resolution, right? So what I want is the negotiators to come and do courses with people here, which teaches a generation of dispute resolution specialists, which can then go and apply those principles, right? I don't think the language or the politics will be the same, but I think some of the ways of engaging people will actually be very similar. And you know, if someone has done this in Northern Ireland or Israel or other places and wants to come and do that in a just transition context here, I think that would be super useful because I don't always see our politics being able to do that. And so perhaps you do need those kinds of conversations, which I think are quite useful. And they may not be techno-economic. I mean, these are definitely more human and political conversations than techno-economic conversations. I think Jean-Michel's point of islands is very well taken in the sense that there is a lot of regional heterogeneity. And what you want to ideally do is identify a few people who understand each of the regions particularly well, right? So even within India, the way Maharashtra's coal transition is going to happen is going to be very different from the way Jharkhand's does because the politics is different, the people are different, the capital intensity is different, all of these kinds of things. And in some senses, what I find is that very few people right now have the patience to identify those people, right? Go to those places, spend a month doing the fieldwork and figure out, look, these are the 4 credible intermediaries and I will work with them for the next 3 years to try to start these conversations. Some of these states haven't even thought about transitioning away from coal, right? It's just not within their imagination. And so you need to introduce it to the political imagination before you can even think of just transitions. And I don't see who is doing that inception in the system right now. And I think people like us should be doing that more and more, perhaps, right? So one big picture response to everyone, which is an open question, which I don't have a good answer for, is like mechanization and capital intensity is a problem everywhere, right? So the employment problem is well beyond coal. I mean, this is happening everywhere. This is the aviation and automotive problem that Jean-Michel was talking about. And in developed countries, I mean, it's not easy, but it's easier. When everything is moving towards capital intensity, like how can you possibly employ people, right? Where do you push the employment conversation, which gives you hope that it's not just all big capital, big machines, lots of poverty? I mean, I'd love some productive engagement with that because I don't know what, you know, like India cannot survive on just a high-tech services economy, but that's kind of what is happening in some senses. And so we want a different breakup and how to move in that direction. I mean, these are deep industrial policy questions which go well beyond the just transition, but I think it's part of it. And I don't have a good answer for those things. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rohit. I'll give each panelist a minute and a half to respond to Rohit's questions and maybe contribute to the discussion before we move to the Q&A with the audience.
Jessie, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, sure, I can. So I suppose more comments, more questions, not comments. So one, maybe you talk about dispute settlement mechanism. Maybe what we should be thinking is, I'm sort of torn because I can see, you know, when I talk to people in government here, they don't know what to do. And when you talk to people in coal regions, nobody loves coal. Nobody says, oh yeah, that we're so glad to be polluted. But there's a very real fear of abandonment, that the state is not going to be there to pick up the pieces, which I think is very different in developing countries than elsewhere, that lack of trust in your social institutions. And you can see when you talk to people, they don't know what to do. So I see a lot of risk that institutions are going to be implanted in developing countries, like coal commissions, which maybe are not the right dispute resolution mechanism for India. Each place will maybe have a different way of needing to do that. But there's certainly the ability and the need, I think, to kind of cross-pollinate between regional level or province, I suppose is what we call them in South Africa, states, provincial and state level governments who need to be doing economic development at their level. And they understand the context, they understand where their competitive advantages might be, what are the barriers to new sectors that might need to be developed, why isn't agriculture actually effective, is it water, is it this, is it agro-processing, in our case it's shortage of electricity supply, you know. South Africa is very lucky in that we actually can put our renewable energy in the coal region. We have slightly less good solar resources. So instead of exceptional, they're only excellent, very close to load, you know. So there's a lot of opportunity there that will apply in other places, not in India. But for me, it's very important that also we think beyond just renewables. There's energy transition, and so maybe some workers will move and maybe there'll be more jobs, but actually this is much more about a whole economy strategy. And so I like that you said, you know, this is an industrial policy question. To me, just transition is an industrial policy question. It's about the 21st century economic development of countries. And within that, there's a focus, right? There's a focus on an area or a sector or a region, but it's really much bigger. So I don't have a question, it was just a series of comments. And yeah, I mean, I do think that there's probably a lot of opportunity for developing country governments to engage around these issues, to learn about what happened in countries that have done this, and then think about kind of how to flip that for the context in which they find themselves today, and the much more difficult global world that we are in now, in terms of what is competitive and what isn't, and what you can export, and kind of the rules of the game, which are just different now to the 70s and 80s. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessie. Johan, a quick minute for you and then a minute for Professor.
Yes, I mean, maybe just to say, I think what I really like about Rohit's perspective is that, Rohit, that you're willing to be somewhat contrarian, because of remembering of the perspective of the down and out person who, you know, is marginalized in the political discussion. You know, and what about each individual? And this is ultimately what just transition is, for me, is about. And to, you know, to stick within my minute, maybe just to say that the challenge for us is to make each political system integrate from top to bottom so effectively that it feels like a village, and that, you know, the people at the bottom, their needs are known and they're somewhat taken care of and account of by the people at the top. And in large countries like India, this is, I assume, must be extremely difficult to do, and that is the challenge.
Professor?
It is very rare that I cannot challenge speakers and thinkers and workers, researchers. It is happening today. It's extremely rare, maybe once every 2 years, every 3 years, but you know well the topic and you have well-organized thinking. So I cannot challenge you at all. I can only congratulate. And I can tell that it's a pleasure seeing that such difficult questions like this question or these questions, because I agree with Jess that it's coming from just transition to transition itself. It's a pleasure to see that the younger generation is working on it with good ideas and a good sense of the reality of the issues. So very welcome anytime to promote what you do, what you think, what you produce. We have videos, we have podcasts, we have many ways of promoting your work and your thinking.
When my book comes
Thank-
out, I'll come to you.
Done. Thank you, Professor. Rohit, a quick round of questions from the audience as well. We have one of them asking, do you know about any successful example that has managed to transition away from coal within an informal economy while keeping the jobs and making sure that the community is also benefited? So any success stories that you can share?
I mean, unfortunately, I think it's a bit too early for that question. I mean, in some senses, what you have seen is that older places which have, let's say, manual underground mines which have closed down, I mean, they've been forced to transition in some ways, but honestly, I don't see jobs coming to those places, right? So success is a very loaded term. But unfortunately, I think the story is more a move to opportunity story, right? Whereas something declines in one place, you're forced to migrate elsewhere. The problem in India is that, I mean, where do you migrate to, right? Like lots of places are saturated, all of these questions. And so in some senses, I think that is the larger question in some senses, that like India has a huge migrate to opportunity story, which is happening. And what you need is the economics to come to the people rather than the people to come to the economics, right? That's a decadal question. That's you need 100 economists working on this. I mean, you should have an army of people addressing this question. So unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to that right now. What I would say is that there's districts like Ramgarh and all in Jharkhand where people are starting to do this very specific work. And so I think over the next half decade, whether it's in South Africa, in Shaanxi in China, in Ramgarh in Jharkhand, you are going to see people taking greater research interest, but also I think investment risks to try to kind of flip these stories, right? Sometimes it may be state-led, sometimes it may be private sector. And actually, I think that is the essential question, right? Who is doing this investment? And in India, in some places, it'll be the state. In some places, you may have to go with kind of, pitch it to 10 different industry associations, try to attract them somewhere. I mean, every state does investor summits, but it's never in this kind of targeted, let me try to create a district ecosystem way. And I think, I mean, in some senses, like what you want is something like the Chinese SEZ model, right? Or kind of the economic zone model. Can you create an ecosystem for leather, for textiles, for toys, whatever it is. But I think, so that's actually one thing which I'm curious about, that, I mean, getting the industry associations more involved in these conversations. I mean, in some senses, all you do is talk to the mining guys and say, you guys are screwed. But what you should be doing is going to all of the other guys and saying, look, what does it take for you to invest in these places and how can we make it happen? I think that might be a more productive way of approaching some of these things.
Thank you. Thank you, Rohit. Linked to one of the points that you made about the role of economists, we have one question. What role, if any, do traditional economic models that examine labor impact have, if any, in just transition? And how could they be changed to incorporate the broader labor impact of an energy transition?
So, I mean, frankly, I think Jesse is more qualified to answer this than I am. I'm not an economist. But what I would say is that what you need is more kind of the regional microeconomics rather than the systemic macroeconomics, right? So after a point, like models are useless. You need to go run your own primary surveys and understand what's happening in communities. And the problem is that so much of development economics, and I mean, I've seen this kind of in PhD programs and all, has been like, what big data set can I get to run a cross-country regression or a subnational regression, right? No, I mean, if you want to do this properly, you go and send someone and have them sit in a district for a month, interact with people, figure out what they should ask on their survey, then run that survey. And if you have an army of PhD students doing this, you can do this in a few years fairly easily. That's not what is rewarded in the profession, unfortunately. So,
Jesse, do you want to quickly contribute?
I mean, I can only agree, and I say that as as a team who've been manipulating the national statistics. Well, not manipulating, but trying to examine it. I mean, it's very important to understand. We were the first people who'd ever bothered to just pull out the full numbers on coal mining and work out what the future impacts would be just of the existing energy policy, right? No one had a sense of that because no one had been thinking about that upstream supply side issue. But I think exactly this. I think you really have to get into the granularity of it in two ways. One, understanding the workforce. I mean, it's a bit different in South Africa. We have a very mechanized coal mining kind of extraction system, quite very formal. People have pensions, but also, we don't really know what people's education levels are. We don't know what their skill sets are, which is a very different question. So how do you migrate them? It's very difficult. Also, the national statistics don't have really very good data, for example, on it's not a very good sampling of coal workers, so you can draw very limited conclusions about their age. So actually, how many people need to be retired early is we've got some ideas, but they're not great. What we have no idea on is how many women depend on selling food informally outside coal mines. How does money flow in the local economies? What are people's livelihood strategies? What are the gender impacts? And that kind of hard work nobody wants to do or fund, or I'm not sure, but that's really where you get into the meat and bones of it. And we need to do that across the whole world where you have not just coal. I mean, I think this is for all sorts of mono industries, right? We don't have a good enough understanding of how to address livelihoods issues.
Thank you, Jessie. A quick question, Rohit, more specifically in the Indian context, where they say the issue of energy is between the center and the state. How can you sort of balance this out while you're looking at this transition, where there is a national mandate to push for clean energy, but some states, as you clearly pointed out, have their own peculiarities. So how do you balance this?
I think this is the essence of federal politics, right? I mean, in some senses, that both sides have levers, both sides are exercising power in one way or the other. And unfortunately, I think in India, what we've seen in the last half decade, especially, is kind of a top-down techno-economic strategy, which does not always consider bottom-up considerations, right? And so, I mean, already we're seeing the renewable energy industry having problems because you started building out your renewable energy before you fixed the finances of your utilities. And so that classic problem of all of those things are happening. So I think in some senses, the ideal is always having a more consultative process, right? The way India's kind of goods and services tax has a council, you should have an energy council with states as well. But I mean, our goods and services tax council is also falling apart. So, I mean, unless you have room for that kind of federalism, then it's just going to be top-down mandates and resistance that comes back towards it. That's not my preference, but I think we're seeing that. Jean-Michel had a comment to make about the last question.
A very small one. Last year, an Indian, Abhijit Banerjee, got the Nobel Prize in Economics with a French, his wife, Esther Duflo. Why? Because experimental approach is key to alleviate poverty. We cannot alleviate poverty without the knowledge of the poor. It's a logical truth now. And what you have to do, Rohit and Jess, is to push the same for to avoid creating new pools of poverty. We have to take into account what are these people, what they have, what they do, what they think, what is possible for them. And we have to tell that it has to be experimental. And World Bank, IMF, and all the people having money, they have to finance such studies. Because if we do not do, we will be unfair. If we are too much unfair, it will block. Because the changes we are looking at are enormous. To do enormous changes, we need quasi everybody on board. And there is a big gender issue, as Jess said.
Just to respond to that, I think experimentation is actually super useful here, right? I mean, if you're going to have regional heterogeneity, then you also have to be willing to take a risk in a district and say it might not work. The problem is that bureaucracies, whether they're multinational or domestic, don't like doing that. And so unless you encourage those forms of administrative and policy risk-taking, I think this will be more difficult than it needs to be.
Thank you, Rohit. Thank you, panelists, for this excellent discussion. We do have a lot more questions in the box, but probably Rohit can respond to them and we can include that in the notes that would follow this live stream. And we'll be more than happy to take the cue from Professor and probably write a paper or a policy brief detailing this topic. I think it as you rightly pointed out, someone needs to take the mantle and push forward the discussion. discussion, and we would be more than happy to do that. So I would like to thank Rohit for that excellent presentation. Jesse and Johan, always wonderful to engage with you all. And thank you, Professor, for being the co-host on this FSR Talks. And stay tuned for our discussion points. And in case you missed something, please check out the live stream version on our YouTube channel. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was brilliant.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks.